The battlefield was a ruin of dust, smoke, and broken bodies. The warrior princess stood alone, her once proud legion scattered across the plain. Every breath carried the iron taste of blood, every sound the echo of war drums beating from the enemy ranks that now encircled her. She tightened her grip on her spear, the last unbroken link to her command, though her arms trembled with fatigue. Around her, the raiders closed in, their eyes filled with the certainty of an easy kill. She had fought without pause, refusing surrender, but the cost was visible in every torn plate of armor and every gash seared across her skin. Yet still she stood, unwilling to kneel. Her people were watching from afar, if not with their eyes, then with the memory of her defiance. She knew her death here would echo, but she wanted more than a noble end. She wanted victory, even if her body could no longer deliver it. The first raider lunged, its blade raised high. She twisted, parried, and drove her spear forward, sending it sprawling. Two more pressed in. She deflected one strike, cut another across the chest, but in that desperate moment the weapon betrayed her. With a sharp crack, her spear shaft splintered in her hands, the sacred weapon shattered into useless fragments. A silence rushed in, deafening in its weight. The enemy laughed, circling closer. To them, her fight was over. She stared at the broken halves, blood dripping from her fingers, her heart pounding with the fury of inevitability. Without her weapon, she was finished. The circle tightened, steel glinting through the haze. Her breath steadied as she raised her fists anyway. If this was her final moment, she would not go quietly. But she knew this was the end. Then the heavens ripped open. A streak of fire cut through the smoke above, burning brighter than the sun's. The ground shook as metal screamed against atmosphere, and all heads turned skyward. Something plummeted toward the battlefield, a blazing fragment of war crashing down into the center of the encirclement. The impact thundered, dust and debris billowing outward in a wave that threw combatants to the ground. The princess staggered, shielding her face, eyes wide with disbelief. As the dust thinned, a figure rose from the crater. Human, wrapped in battered armor, parachute cords still dangling, visor cracked but eyes sharp. He coughed, shook off the landing, and looked straight at her. The raiders hesitated, stunned by the intrusion. The human sized up the battlefield in an instant, taking in her shattered weapon, her circle of enemies, and the impossible odds. Then, with a half-smile cutting through exhaustion, he said the words no one expected. "Need a hand?" The enemy roared with laughter, mocking the absurdity of one more lone fighter stepping into certain death. But the princess felt something shift inside her. The words, simple yet defiant, cracked through her despair like lightning through a storm. This was no reinforcement, no miracle army. It was just one human, armed with nothing but nerve, standing against the same impossible odds, and somehow, impossibility itself seemed weaker. She straightened her posture, broken spear still clutched in one hand like a dagger. The human loosened the straps of his pack, pulling free what little gear had survived the fall, a combat knife, a half-crushed sidearm, and the confidence of someone who had no concept of surrender. Around them, the raiders grew restless, no longer entertained. They moved to close the circle, eager to finish both alien princess and human intruder together. But the human didn't flinch. He shifted into a fighting stance, calm and measured. There was no hesitation in his movements, only the quiet readiness of someone who had walked into impossible fights before and lived to tell the tale. The princess watched him with disbelief, then with a slow, burning realization. He was serious. He intended to fight beside her, not for glory, not for duty to her people, but because she was outnumbered and he refused to leave anyone to die alone. The raiders surged, blades flashing. The princess raised her fragment of a spear. The human gripped his knife tighter. And for the first time since her weapon had broken, she felt a spark of something she had thought extinguished. Hope. She understood then that this moment would be remembered, not for the tragedy of her fall, but for the defiance of two warriors who chose to stand shoulder to shoulder against the impossible. In the silence before the storm of battle, her eyes met his. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Together, they turned to face the horde. The raiders surged forward, their confidence born of numbers and cruelty. The human moved first, fast and deliberate, meeting the closest attacker with a brutal strike of steel against flesh. He wasted no motion, each move precise, his knife flashing as though guided by instinct. The princess followed his lead, turning broken spear into a jagged blade, driving it into gaps of armor where her knowledge of enemy physiology gave her an edge. Together, their rhythm formed quickly, his improvisation blending with her calculated precision. One raider lunged at her flank, but before the blade could strike, the human shoved her aside, catching the blow on his forearm guard, countering with a slash across the raider's throat. She spun low, stabbing upward through the soft plates of another's abdomen. Their movements aligned, not practiced, but born of necessity and trust forged in seconds. The circle of enemies wavered, no longer laughing. What was supposed to be an execution had turned into resistance, fierce and unrelenting. The human shouted quick commands between breaths, short, clear words: left, duck, move. She obeyed without hesitation, surprised by the clarity of his instincts. In return, she warned him of enemy tactics, patterns of movement only her people knew. They adapted to each other with the speed of survival itself. Blood splattered across the dust. Raiders fell one by one, their overconfidence collapsing as the pair carved a path through bodies. The princess fought with renewed fire, fueled by the realization that she was no longer alone. The human fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, daring every strike to end him and defying each one with a counterblow. But the weight of numbers pressed hard. More raiders poured into the fray, drawn by the defiance. The two fighters were driven back toward each other, their circle tightening again. Breathing heavy, muscle screaming, the princess risked a glance at her unlikely ally. He was bleeding from a cut across the cheek, armor scorched from the landing, but his grin hadn't faltered. He thrived in the chaos. For the first time in her life, she saw a warrior who did not care for rank, lineage, or ceremony, only the fight in front of him. She realized why humans were feared across battlefields despite their smaller numbers and shorter histories. They fought with an audacity that ignored logic, turning desperation into strength. The raiders regrouped, forming a wedge to crush them in a single push. The princess braced herself, clutching the shard of her spear tighter. The human tapped her shoulder, drawing her attention. "On my mark," he whispered. She didn't ask what he planned. She simply nodded. The wedge charged. At the last instant, the human dove forward, rolling between the front lines, knife flashing to hamstring the leader. The formation collapsed in confusion. The princess struck from the other side, her broken weapon slashing throats and stabbing joints. Together they broke the charge, cutting the wedge apart before it could crush them. The battlefield erupted in chaos again. Breath ragged, the princess realized her heartbeat matched his rhythm. She no longer thought of him as an intruder, but as a brother in arms. Their bond was not spoken, but in the clash of steel and the spray of blood, it became undeniable. Then came the shift. The enemy commanders, watching from the rear, barked orders. Archers raised their bows, a wall of arrows ready to cut them down. The princess's eyes widened. There was no cover, no chance to block so many at once. She turned toward him, prepared to meet death. But the human didn't flinch. He yanked a metal cylinder from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it skyward. The grenade exploded midair, scattering the archers with shrapnel and fire. The survivors screamed, disorganized, retreating to regroup. The battlefield fell into brief silence, the two warriors standing alone amidst a sea of corpses. Their chests heaved, blades dripping red, eyes scanning for the next wave. For a moment, time slowed. Dust hung in the air, curling around them like a shroud. The princess turned toward him fully, truly seeing him, not just as an ally, but as something else. He had fallen from the sky, uninvited, into a battle not his own, and yet he fought with more conviction than most of her kindred. She felt her voice tremble as she asked, "Why help me? You owe me nothing." The human adjusted his grip on the knife, shrugged, and spoke with quiet conviction. "No one fights alone. Not while I can stand." The words struck deeper than any weapon. They were simple, without flourish, but heavy with meaning. Her people fought for honor, for tradition, for bloodlines. He fought for something rawer, something she could not name but felt in her chest like a fire she had nearly lost. She nodded once, swallowing her response. The next wave of raiders formed at the edge of the battlefield, their numbers greater than before. The human shifted his stance, ready for more. The princess raised her broken spear, battered but unbroken. And though exhaustion threatened to collapse her, she stood taller now, the spark of his defiance burning in her veins. The legend was already beginning. Two warriors from two worlds, back to back against an army, holding the line where none should have stood. What had started as her final moment of despair had become something else entirely, a story of defiance that neither death nor defeat could erase. As the enemy roared and charged again, she tightened her grip, her voice steady and clear, spoken not to him but to the battlefield itself. "Then let them learn what it means to face us." They braced together as the storm came crashing down once more. The enemy surged once more, bolstered by sheer numbers and the fury of commanders unwilling to be shamed by two warriors. The ground shook beneath the stampede of armored feet, dust clouds swallowing the horizon. The humans scanned their approach with sharp eyes, calculating every angle, every distance. Where others would see certain death, he saw opportunities waiting to be carved open. He pressed a fragment of metal into the princess's hand, a shard from his landing craft sharpened by impact. She recognized its strength immediately. It gleamed harder than her world's steel. She strapped it to the remnants of her spear, forming a jagged but lethal point. He gave nothing but a nod, and she understood. Survival meant turning scraps into weapons, defeat into defiance. The first raiders reached them, swinging broad axes and serrated blades. The humans stepped into the strike, catching an arm, twisting, and using the raiders' own momentum to snap bone. The princess thrust her reforged spear, the alien shard piercing through armor like it was cloth, felling her foe in a single thrust. Their weapons might have been crude compared to the enemy's numbers, but precision and synergy outweighed brute force. The tide thickened. The raiders pressed harder, encircling tighter. The human barked clipped directions, his voice unshaken despite exhaustion. She followed, trusting each word, learning that his mind was as sharp as his blade. He fought not just with strength but with strategy, bending the enemy formation against itself, forcing them into bottlenecks where numbers became a hindrance. A squad of heavily armored elites entered, towering figures with shields layered thick as walls. The princess faltered, knowing how devastating they were, but the humans simply smirked. He scanned their stance, spotted the weaknesses, and whispered his plan. She lunged first, feigning a reckless strike. The elites raised shields in unison, confident in their defense. That was when the human slid beneath their formation, his knife plunging into exposed ankles and tendons. The princess followed with overhead strikes, driving her spear shard into gaps as they collapsed. What seemed invincible crumbled with cunning and coordination. More bodies piled, but their enemies' morale frayed. Whispers spread among the raiders, two warriors, standing against hundreds, moving like shadows impossible to corner. Every kill they delivered echoed louder than numbers could silence. Fear began to outweigh bloodlust. The human paused only long enough to catch a breath, scanning the battlefield. He spotted a rise nearby, a ridge overlooking the field. He pointed with his blade. If they reached higher ground, they could turn the battle further. She didn't question it. They carved a path uphill, every step contested, every meter bought with blood. He used his dwindling supply of explosives sparingly, each blast scattering clusters of foes to open the path. She guarded his flanks, intercepting ambushes with a ruthless precision that impressed even him. At the ridge, the human improvised defenses. He overturned boulders for cover, dug shallow trenches with bare hands, and arranged fallen weapons as traps. The princess marveled at how quickly he transformed chaos into strategy. Where her people planned battles for weeks, he crafted war from fragments in minutes. Side by side, they fortified their position, preparing for the next wave. The enemy did not disappoint. Furious at the humiliation, the raider commander himself stepped onto the field, a hulking brute clad in blackened armor adorned with trophies of slaughtered foes. His presence silenced the battlefield. His warriors rallied behind him with renewed rage. He raised a massive blade, pointing it at the pair, declaring their defiance would end in ruin. The princess's chest tightened, but the human only grinned, lips bloody, eyes alight with defiance. He had fought commanders before, she realized, not of her world, but wars carried the same face, no matter the species. The commander charged, a mountain of rage. The human dodged narrowly, countering with strikes too small to kill, but enough to harass. The princess joined, their attacks weaving together, distracting, wearing him down. He was strong, but strength without adaptability was brittle. Every blow the commander struck cracked the earth, but none struck flesh. The human taunted, infuriating him, dragging him into mistakes. The princess exploited every opening, spear shard cutting deeper each time. Finally, the human timed it perfectly, sliding beneath a swing, slashing tendons at the knee, sending the commander staggering. The princess lunged with everything she had, driving her weapon into his chest with a cry that split the air. The giant fell, and with him, the enemies will faltered. The raiders hesitated, shock rippling through their ranks. Their leader lay broken at the feet of two warriors they had mocked as prey. Fear broke their formation, hesitation unraveling their resolve. The human seized the moment, raising the fallen commander's blade high and bellowing a challenge that shook the field. The princess echoed with her own cry, a sound her people reserved for legends. The battlefield shifted. Raiders, once certain of victory, began to waver. Some turned to flee, others hesitated, and still others charged in desperation. But none carried the same fire as before. Their unity fractured, and in that fracture, the two warriors found victory. Bloodied and battered, they pressed the attack downhill, scattering enemies who only hours before had seemed unstoppable. Every strike they delivered now carried the weight of inevitability. The enemy was no longer fighting two warriors. They were fighting the birth of a story that would outlive them. By the time the sun dipped lower, the field was littered with broken weapons and fleeing raiders. The human dropped the massive blade, chest heaving, body trembling from exhaustion. The princess leaned on her spear shard, breath ragged, eyes wide with disbelief at what they had accomplished. Against every law of battle, they had not only survived, they had broken an army's spirit. She looked at him, words failing to capture the storm of thoughts in her mind. He had turned certain death into victory with nothing but grit, wit, and unshakable resolve. Her people had always believed strength was in tradition, in bloodlines, in rituals of war. But this man had shown her another truth, that strength lay in refusing to yield, no matter the odds. The battlefield grew silent. The legend was already taking root. The battlefield stank of iron and ash, the cries of the dying fading into silence. The princess stood among the wreckage, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her spirit burning with a clarity she had never known. Across from her, the human wiped blood from his blade, his chest rising and falling like a man who had given everything yet still refused to collapse. Between them lay the shattered remains of the raider army's courage. She looked at the horizon where survivors fled into the distance, no longer warriors, but broken shadows. For generations, her people had spoken of battles where victory was decided by bloodlines, strategy, or sheer strength. Yet here was a new truth carved into the dirt. Two strangers, unbound by history, had stood shoulder to shoulder and turned inevitability into legend. The human spoke first, his voice hoarse but steady. "It's not over. They'll regroup. Leaders don't forgive humiliation." He wasn't boasting, only stating fact. She knew he was right. What they had done today was more than survival, it was provocation. A raiding horde shamed on its own ground would return with vengeance, and next time, their numbers would be doubled. Her people, if they heard the story, would never believe it. They would say she fabricated it to preserve honor, that no human could have done what this one had. Yet she had seen it with her own eyes. He had not fought for glory or recognition. He had fought because surrender was unthinkable, because leaving her to die was not an option in his mind. She knelt, pressing her spear shard into the ground like a marker. "This field belongs to us now," she said, her voice low but resolute. He glanced at her, and though he said nothing, she saw the faintest trace of a smile before his eyes sharpened again, always scanning, always anticipating danger. Together, they scavenged what little remained. Armor, blades, fragments of supplies, everything that could be repurposed was gathered. He fashioned slings from enemy belts, traps from broken shields, and signal markers from burning wreckage. She realized his every action carried foresight. Where her people fought with rigid traditions, he fought with adaptability, reshaping chaos into survival. As the night fell, the stars burned bright overhead. They sat beside a small fire, neither speaking for a long while. The silence was not uneasy, but weighted with the enormity of what had passed. Finally, she broke it. "You're kind. Why do you fight like this?" No code, no ritual, only stubbornness. He poked at the flames with a stick, his gaze distant. "Because if we stop, we die. We're not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most advanced. But we refuse to quit. That's what makes us dangerous." His words struck her as more profound than any war chant. She had spent her life memorizing the songs of her people, oaths carved in stone, rules etched into generations. Yet none of those had saved her when the circle closed. What had saved her was this man's refusal to bend. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across their scarred armor. She realized then that what she had witnessed was more than a battle. It was a glimpse into the heart of humanity, raw, imperfect, relentless. A force that could not be measured by weapons or lineage. By dawn, scouts from her people arrived, weapons drawn, ready to avenge what they assumed would be her corpse. Instead, they found her standing tall with a human at her side, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies. Shock rippled through their ranks. Whispers spread quickly. How could two alone do what entire war bands had failed to accomplish? She addressed them before doubt could turn into dismissal. She told the truth plainly. The human had fallen from the sky and fought beside her, not as subordinate or tool, but as equal. Her warriors, skeptical, looked upon the field of corpses and could not argue with the evidence written in blood and steel. Legends were not made from words alone, but from undeniable outcomes. The human remained silent through her speech, standing with the calm of one who needed no validation. When her people asked for proof, he offered none. When they pressed for his allegiance, he gave no promises. He simply stated, "I fight where I stand. If that's here, then so be it." His refusal to bow earned their reluctant respect. Among her kind, pride was sacred, but so was truth. And truth stood before them in the form of a battlefield turned graveyard, carved by two who should have fallen but did not. Days later, stories began to spread. Raiders whispered of a demon human who fought with fire in his veins. Her people whispered of their princess, saved not by divine intervention, but by a mortal stranger who refused to quit. Both versions twisted, grew, and spread until the truth became something larger than either of them. The princess knew what was coming. This battle was only the beginning. The raiders would return in greater force, and her people would have to choose whether to dismiss humanity as fragile outsiders or embrace them as allies who brought something no other species could replicate. She glanced at the human one evening as preparations began for the next inevitable war. He sat sharpening his blade, expression calm, eyes still scanning, restless for the next fight. She understood then that his presence was more than survival, it was transformation. He had changed the way she saw war, the way her people would one day see humanity, and perhaps the way the galaxy itself would reckon with their kind. For the first time in her life, she felt no fear of what came next. She felt something stronger, something she could not name but that he embodied in every breath: defiance. And as the horizon burned with the promise of battles yet to come, she whispered words that would echo through generations. "Let them come. We will not fall." The human lifted his blade in silent agreement.